Hi. Today we're going to talk about the Italian Renaissance in art. Sorry. This is one of the glorious periods of Western civilization. Not, I think, in all arts, but certainly in the visual arts. The Beaux-Arts, I guess, namely painting and sculpture. A couple of other minor arts, too. Some background. Why Italy? Why did this happen in Italy? Later in other countries, but in no country even dimly rivaling the Italians. Not even dimly. Okay. By, let's say, 1300, Italy was, let's call it the richest country in Europe. Now we better explain, Italy was merely a geographic expression. Politically there was no Italy. Politically there was no Italy until 1871. 1871, only 132 years ago. Until that time, Italy was divided into territories, into kingdoms, if you like, separate kingdoms with separate governments. And during the Renaissance, at least, these places were often at war with each other. So, Italy means people who spoke Italian, let's say. These people still, because of language, I think, felt a bond with each other, regarded themselves as Italians, but there was no unified country. Second, the word Renaissance, Renaissance, it's a French word. In Italian, Rinascimento. I've seen the Koreans are so inventive, so imaginative in the names of their shops. I saw a shop called Rinascimento 4 or 5 years ago. I don't know if it's still around, here in Daegu. What? Amazing names. Renaissance would be a cliche in Korea. That's probably the reason why the people chose Rinascimento. Anyway, the word means rebirth, whether in French or Italian. Rebirth of what? People used to say. By the way, this name is, I think, mostly the result of 18th and 19th century historians, adoring historians. It also implies I would say, a hostility toward the medieval church. Because the implications. Rebirth of what? At least it was a rebirth of interest in classical antiquity. This means Greek and Roman, especially Greek. And this was true. Now, to say that medieval man knew nothing of these things would be misleading. But they knew very little about art, the visual arts, were hostile toward classical visual arts, largely because of all those nude bodies running around, male and female. The church was not, let's say, didn't approve of that kind of thing. Okay, so rebirth of what? Rebirth of interest in classical antiquity. The big impetus that this rebirth received came in 1453 with the fall of Constantinople to the Turks, the Ottoman Turks. After a long struggle, after more than 1,000 years, the Eastern Roman Empire, as it could probably properly be called, fell finally. It had been falling for 300 years, but it had somehow remained politically viable until 1453. Now, in the years preceding that, a gradual exodus of scholars, with their Greek, because the Eastern Roman Empire was a Greek empire, Greek speaking, Greek writing, Greek culture. Not that they loved the nude bodies very much either. Christianity tends to be a little hostile toward that. But we'll discuss that sometime too, maybe. But gradually the Greek scholars had left with their Greek texts. In the West, there had not been many good Greek texts, reliable Greek texts. Now, suddenly, let's say beginning 1400 even, beginning in 1400, this exodus mainly to Italy, because where would these scholars go? Syria? No, they couldn't go south. That was all Turk. They couldn't even go very far in the west, because Greece was all part of, or soon would be part of, the Ottoman Empire. They fled to Italy as the nearest and most congenial, most welcoming place. And they brought these texts, especially of Platon, whom we discussed yesterday. Many other texts too, poetic texts. This was the Renaissance, the rebirth of interest in classical antiquity. Along with them came the statuary, the sculptures, and various literary forms. Lyric poetry gradually came to Italy. The Italians mastered this quickly, mastered Greek quickly, much earlier than anyone else. And so on a literary level, Italy was the place of the Renaissance also, not only in the visual arts. Okay, second sense of the word Renaissance. This one doesn't hold so well, but people like to use it. Rebirth of what people like to call the human spirit. People, let's call it humanism. Let's call it a reaffirmation of the value of being human, of the value of this world, the secular world, of this life, in contrast to the pessimistic, very negative and anti-secular spirit of the medieval church. After all, to the medieval church and to a kind of classical Catholicism, this world is a valley of tears and sorrows. We come to this world with nothing. We are dust and ashes, and to dust and ashes we will return. A kind of dualistic, a kind of Platonic dualism permeates, and still permeates, I think, Catholicism and really Protestantism too. What is this dualism, by the way? Dualism means that there are two principles at work in the universe and in man. Let's call one light, the other darkness. One spirit, the other flesh. One good, the other evil. One, we've already said the main ones. Wherever Christianity emphasizes this, really it's running contrary to Christianity, to the roots of Christianity, which the fathers of the church tried very hard to oppose. But many of them were dualists too. One or two words more on this, because it's so important. Platonic dualism means Plato's tendency to deprecate, disparage, dismiss the body and experience of this world as more or less illusory, illusion, not moral evil, notice, illusion, and exalt the spirit, the mind, the forms, intellect. Okay. When Christianity gets a hold of this, it turns into soul good, body bad, spirit good, flesh evil. The moral dimension enters this Platonic game. And this is very damaging to Christianity. And Christianity has never really recovered its balance in this sense. And it really is something that Asian Christians especially, ought to be a little more aware of. Because Asians tend to be totally innocent of that kind of dualism. You have some of it in your tradition, but body as evil, I don't think so. The whole concept of sin, it always seems to me, is quite foreign to Asians as far as I can see. Does that make Asians not Christians? No. But it makes most Asians, I think, not Western Christians. And maybe Asians can bring a greater balance, a better perspective toward body and flesh and this world than the West has ever been able to generate in Christianity. By the way, a couple words more about that. In the Bible, in the Old Testament, in Genesis, God creates the world and he saw that it was good. Well, this doesn't sound like dualism. And then Old Testament Judaism certainly knows nothing about the flesh being evil and the spirit good, nothing about this dualism. But dualism still grows up in the intertestamental period, apocalyptic times, between the end of the writing of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. Apocalyptic tends to stress that the spirit is good and the body is not. Has that tendency. Certainly in Christianity it did. Okay, then in the New Testament, the crowning anthem to that's contrary to dualism is John 3:16. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. Even the existence of Christ, the incarnate Christ, is a statement that God created and loves and values the human person, body and soul, spirit and flesh. But generally, the Platonic influence easily swept that away to produce that dualistic perspective: body evil, spirit soul good, flesh evil, sexuality evil, women evil, women as the source of life, but more women as the source of male sexual desire, evil. This really is unfortunate, and it has produced mostly regrettable results in Christianity through the centuries. Okay, and besides that, it's really anti-Christian. It's really contrary to Christianity. But the flesh remains a problem, no doubt, to everyone, but not with that dimension of evil. Okay, back to the Italian Renaissance. So, does Renaissance really mean the rebirth of respect for the human body, respect for this world, respect for the full human person? In the Italian Renaissance it tends to, yes. And this meant that the Italian Renaissance thinkers were really on a collision course against the Church. It's hard not to see the Renaissance and post-Renaissance and even the Age of Science as a declaration of war against the Catholic Church. Maybe many of the people, Galileo, did not intend it to be this way, but the Church almost forced Galileo to see it that way. The whole spirit, one can see the whole modern period, which begins with the Italian Renaissance, the whole modern period as an attempt to, as a declaration of war against the Catholic Church. And that includes Protestantism too. Okay, back to the Renaissance. Did the Renaissance mean this? In some Italians, yes. In some Italians, yes. A rebirth of the human spirit, of respect for this world, this body, this life. But this too had a forerunner in Saint Francis, the greatest of all the saints, San Francesco, who died in 1226. Francis loved the things of this world and could be said to be the father of the Renaissance. That is, this world is beautiful. God made it beautiful. God blessed it. The things of this world are beautiful. Francis, the saint of joy, a rare commodity, stimulated interest in this world, so that the Franciscans, after the death of Francis, the Franciscans were in many ways early scientists, because they studied everything, especially nature, and they were early scientists in the modern sense. Science had existed before, of course, in someone like Aristotle. Okay, back to our problem, our topic. Where does the Italian Renaissance begin in art? Really, it begins with one man, and really, in the end, perhaps he's the greatest of them all. This is Giotto, Giotto. Giotto's dates, I think, 1267, 1337, maybe. Pretty close. Where? Florence, of course. Excuse me, Dr. Shin. May I get talking about Giotto? A genius, much greater genius of art than Michelangelo, than Leonardo, much greater, a giant. The only one of that group who can rival him maybe a little bit is Raphael, but Raphael's life was so short that in the end I don't think it's the case. The only one ultimately who rivals him in Italy is Tiziano, the greatest of them all, in my opinion. But I'll talk about that later, sometime. Back to our Renaissance. Now, you see that Giotto's dates are very early, and people certainly don't think of the Italian Renaissance as being around 1300. This is usually called or used to be called the Proto-Renaissance, Proto hyphen. That is early, not continuous thereafter. There's a good reason for this, because Giotto's contemporary in the same little town was Dante. And soon after Dante, Petrarch was there, Florentine, basically, and Boccaccio. Well, what an amazing, amazing phenomenon that those people and others that we know less of, or are less well known, should appear in the same place at the same time. This forces us to focus on the center of the Italian Renaissance, which was Florence. Florence was a miracle, just like Athens was, just like 5th century BCE Athens. A miracle. These two towns were about the same size, too, but Florence didn't have 100,000 slaves running around. But Florence was rich, and divided too often by political tension and open civil war, the Italians having trouble getting along with each other always. But big economic stakes were in play there. And when the economic stakes become big, then people's passions are aroused even more powerfully, perhaps. Anyway, during that Proto-Renaissance, Giotto created the Renaissance in art, in painting. How? If one compares a Giotto with any earlier work, what do we have? The earlier works are mostly Byzantine in style. Now, what's the Byzantine style? The Byzantine style tends to be two-dimensional, no third dimension. Bodies are totally unbelievable in their appearance, anatomically, anatomy, body, and also, more important, have no weight, no depth. Byzantine art is pervaded with religious mysticism, frankly. It's a mystical art. That doesn't mean all the artists were mystics, but that's what the patrons were looking for, and that's certainly what the churches were looking for. Always the church was the great patron of the arts until the Italian Renaissance. Now, this is still true in Giotto's time. Giotto had one great private patron, as we will see. Giotto is the most revolutionary painter in the history of Western art, I think it's safe to say. Suddenly in him, the human body has weight. Suddenly in him, humans are recognizable, physically recognizable, bulky, present in space. Even more important, Giotto was psychologically a genius. His people are complex. His people think, frown, have worries. Where did these people come from? There were no antecedents for Giotto's people. What a genius. And he lived a long time. In Florence. Florence. Now, the one exception to his... I'm not sure of this, but the great exception, his masterpiece is not in Florence, but it's in Padua, as we say in English, which is 20 miles away from Venice, on the mainland. Padua is a pretty great place anyway, not visited by many tourists, I'm sure, except for the Cappella degli Scrovegni, or the Scrovegni Chapel. What a name. Scrovegni. He was a rich merchant who commissioned Giotto to paint his little chapel near a church, I don't remember the name of the church, in Padua. And Giotto covered the walls with his greatest paintings. What a wonderful place. What a glorious, glorious place. Visit it sometime. Any Giotto has been restored. After all, these things are 800 years old. 800 years old. Well, 750 anyway. Okay. Those are the main points. Now, but after Giotto, although there were many artists who admired him and tried to imitate him, the imitations are kind of crude. The psychological insight is seldom visible. But at least his followers gave people weight, physical presence. Also, I didn't say this. I mentioned psychology, but I should say this word. Giotto's paintings are dramatic. People interact. God, Jesus interacts. There is drama, human drama, interest. This had never been seen before in Western art. Some in the Romans, but not much Roman art survives. You see some drama if you go to Pompeii. Many Koreans like to go to Pompeii. To me, vastly overrated, not worth the trip. It's certainly not worth a day outside Rome. But there, the most interesting thing in the ruins is the Villa of the Mysteries, it's called. And these wall paintings, they'll discuss the method here sometime, the technique. The wall paintings show a drama going on. But the Romans and the Greeks didn't care much about perspective, and that's where we're going in our discussion. Back to Giotto and his followers. The style that dominated Europe in the 14th and early 15th century, much of the 15th century, we call International Gothic. A good name for it, International Gothic. Now, International Gothic tended to paint just like the tapestries, and tapestries are notoriously two-dimensional. Depth in a tapestry? No, tapestry art is wonderful. Some glorious tapestry art of the 15th and early 16th century, the age of glory for tapestry. But the emphasis is on surface decoration. Surface decoration. Color, yes. Giotto is not a master of color, by the way. I wouldn't criticize him for it, but color is not very interesting in Giotto. In International Gothic painting, it is very interesting. So this International Gothic style, which was so popular everywhere, including Italy, swept away a little bit some of the gains that Giotto had presented. What it amounts to really is that he had no worthy follower, no worthy successor. Some painters are wonderful, International Gothic painters, wonderful. But Giotto's innovations were mostly forgotten, neglected. Okay, until from 1400 to 1427, Masaccio, in Florence, of course. Masaccio is the worthy successor to Giotto, but as you can see, he lived only 27 years. Wow! If he had lived as long as Giotto had lived, what would have happened? What a genius. He is the successor. There is no other until his time. Now, 1400 to 1427, people still don't think of that as Renaissance. In lectures, I often would give dates of the Renaissance as starting with the fall of Constantinople, 1453. It's very convenient. Okay, some Greek scholars and texts reached Italy before then, but 1453 is a good, solid date. 1450 to 1600, good general dates for the Renaissance. But general is general. And it applies in every other country, but not Italy. We know things started much earlier in Italy, and went much further too, in most directions anyway. Giotto, Masaccio. Masaccio's men are Giotto's men. They are impressive, physically impressive, if not beautiful. They are serious, they are dignified. They are Italian Renaissance men. Masaccio carries portraiture and his depiction of human beings much farther than Giotto had done. Masaccio's men, in his masterpiece, which is in the Chiesa del Carmine Church, over on the south bank of the Arno River, which runs through Florence. What a masterpiece. The main painting there, his main painting there, is called The Tribute. The subject is the relatively absurd subject of a man comes to Christ and asks him, should we pay taxes? Christ, how does it go? Christ says, go find a fish and and open the mouth of the fish and you'll find a coin and bring it to me. I think that's how it goes. Pretty absurd. Absurd by New Testament standards of miracles, I think. What's the point? But then Christ takes the coin and says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's. Okay, how often has this topic been depicted in art? Never. Masaccio's the only one, as far as I know. In some minor instance, maybe. Anyway, that church, that wall, that fresco, time to talk about fresco, is one of the masterpieces of Western art. And the man did it when he was 25, 26. Wow. Now, what is the form that most of these painters used, that Giotto used in the Scrovegni Chapel and in all his major works at Santa Croce, that Masaccio used on the walls there in the Carmine? The Italians call it fresco. This comes from al fresco. Al fresco means painted while it's fresh. This is wall painting, mural painting, and what the painters had to do and had to master, because it was a special kind of art, not like canvas art where one can take one's time. First they cleaned a wall, cleaned the whole wall. Then in a section, 2 feet by 2 feet maybe in the upper left somewhere. They apply this plaster, basically. Now it dries fairly quickly, so the artist has to move quickly and paint a little bit quickly. Can't take his time, can't take a break. And he has to have this world planned out. What's going to go where? Has to be planned out. And then section by section. Now this is what Michelangelo later did in the Sistine Chapel. And no wonder it took him 4 years to cover the ceiling. And he was a kind of young man then. And it took him about 7 years to do the Last Judgment there on the wall. This is fresco. Many of the masterpieces of Italian art are done in fresco. In my opinion, though, the greatest of them all, Titian seldom worked in fresco. Titian was a master businessman. Now, Titian's much later, so I'm jumping a little bit. One other footnote on fresco. When Leonardo tried to do fresco, most famously in The Last Supper, he decided, well, he wanted to try a different way. He wanted oils, because oil was the medium used by artists on canvas. This had developed really in the north, in Flanders, in Belgium, by Van Eyck, Jan van Eyck, one of the masters, one as great as anyone in Italy, except maybe Titian. We'll talk about that, the Northern Renaissance, some other time. We're talking about the Italian Renaissance. But Leonardo was impatient, innovative, a restless man, always wanting to discover new things, which is what makes him the genius, the prototype of human genius, I think, maybe Leonardo. He's the prototype because he is so curious to know everything, and he's not content with superficials. He wants to know what makes things happen, what makes things work, and he's never content until he digs. The Leonardo of the notebooks is the prototype of human genius. In painting, this harmed him a little bit because he was so innovative, as in the case of that Last Supper, putting oil into the mix of his paints. Well, oil could not penetrate and survive that plaster. It stayed on the surface and then very soon dried and peeled off. Within 3 years it was peeling off. So that non-masterpiece, that stillborn masterpiece, famous image, great image, but it's not Leonardo's, it's restorers, the restorer's art, and it's been restored 20 times, in Milan. Back to our sequence. Now, what's happening in 15th century Florence politically? Giotto's age had been a democracy, pretty much a democracy, as much a democracy as Athens was. In the 15th century, though, the Medici family, led by the Urvater, the founder almost, not the founder, but the first great man of the family, Cosimo de' Medici, a very rich, fantastically rich family, made a lot of money by banking especially. The Institute of Banking, the bank, by the way, goes far to explain the Renaissance itself. If there had not been the bankers, there would not have been the Renaissance. That's simple. Banking changed everything, so as often, economic change is what produces cultural and artistic change in many ways. Okay, so Cosimo de' Medici was a giant, vastly rich man, and he became kind of the ruler of Florence for about 30 years during the first half of the 15th century. He was admired and respected by everyone, it seems. I don't know the details. His grandson was Lorenzo de' Medici, who was a much lesser man in many ways. He lost a lot of the family money, a lovable, great man, but not as great a man as his grandfather Cosimo. Anyway, the point is that there was peace, and Florentines were proud of being Florentines, just as the Athenians were proud, and just as I said yesterday, the British were proud of being Englishmen, especially after the Spanish Armada. I'm making a point here that in these golden ages, there tends to be a high level of patriotism, if that's not the word, pride of national pride, identity, and where that isn't, one is less likely to find this golden age. Students of golden ages seem to think. Excuse me. Okay, so Florence was a great place to be in that first half of the 15th century. And suddenly we had giants in other arts. Brunelleschi, a genius, an architectural genius and a great sculptor too. He is the architect really of the Italian Renaissance. He returned art to the classical ideals. The Pantheon in Rome became kind of the ideal. The Parthenon they couldn't get to, Turkish territory. The Pantheon in Roman, became kind of an ideal. These Italians were obsessed with mathematics, and the great painters, many of them, were mathematicians. And certainly the architects were mathematicians, and they became fascinated by proportion, geometrical proportion. They weren't aiming for the great heights of the Gothic, the French Gothic. They were content with something down to earth. In fact, it suited better the mood of the Renaissance, which is, this earth is great. Gothic, high, aspiring steeples and things, that was typical of the 12th century and the 13th century, when men aspired to God, let's say, the divine. But the Italian Renaissance was making a different statement. It was saying, man is glorious. Man's achievements in this world are glorious. So long as man is rational and seeks wisdom, man can live in harmony here in this world. All this humanism. Okay. We're discussing mainly painting, though, so I won't linger on Brunelleschi, but he was certainly the equal of Masaccio, more really. Others, Ghiberti, the sculptor, Donatello, the sculptor. These guys, the glory of the Italian Renaissance in sculpture just about equals the glory of the Renaissance in painting. These were greats, immortals. And in architecture too. Not outside Italy, but in Italy, especially in Florence. Okay, back to painting. The background, though, is the Medici family. Okay, it's in the second half of the 15th century when things really begin to happen, when there seem to be so many great painters. Now the Renaissance had spread far beyond Florence, to Venice, to Mantova, to Milano, to Umbria, that is, to Urbino, and finally to Rome. The big shift came late in the 15th, early in the 16th century, when suddenly Florentine popes appeared, Medici popes, Julius II, and what was the second one? I don't remember right now. It doesn't matter. Anyway, for about 25 years, from 1500 to 1527, this is called the High Renaissance. The High Renaissance is not Florence, it's Rome. During the High Renaissance, every great artist was in Rome. At the same time, if you look at the greatest of all, I would say the greatest of all Renaissance paintings, Raphael's School of Athens, that famous image, with Plato and Aristotle in the center and other guys scattered around in the spacious hall. I'm going to find it because you have to know this. It is the masterpiece of the Italian Renaissance, one of the masterpieces of world art. Just a second, let me find it. Giancamagnon. Must be here. Here. Oh my God, did they not put it here? Oh my God, they didn't put it here. Ah! That's incredible. This is an art history book, a great one, but I suppose because it's such a cliche. Sorry, I can't find it now. I won't take the time to find it. But School of Athens, fresco, in the Vatican, Raphael. Very large, with Plato and Aristotle in the middle. Do you know, should I take a minute to find it? Okay. This is Raphael's School of Athens. It's the masterpiece of Italian Renaissance art. Nothing in the end compares with it. In my own opinion, though, Raphael is only the second greatest Italian Renaissance painter, because the first is Titian. Let's look at that one on the bottom, too, while we're at it. Another great Raphael. Madonna. He's the master of the Madonna. Titian has to be second in that, but Titian's first in everything else. Now, the Sistine Madonna, it's called, is in Dresden, Germany. It's on canvas, of course, but the School of Athens is a wall painting, fresco. Good, thank you. Those 27 years we have what is called the High Renaissance, when everyone was in Rome. In the School of Athens itself, Raphael depicts himself, a young man after all, he died at 37, to the side. In the center is Leonardo, one of the two. He represents Plato, and down on the floor in front of him is Michelangelo. Well, there we have the monument to the Italian Renaissance right there, conscious of itself too. These Italians were so aware of what they were doing and what had happened, of the magnitude of what they had and what they were. So intelligent, so lucid. They had their shortcomings, spiritually somewhat naive, I think, as humanists tend to be. But on the level of art, these were the most sophisticated men in the history of art. Tremendous. And there it is in one painting, Raphael, Leonardo, and Michelangelo, all three of them in Rome at the same time. Kind of a miracle, that. During the High Renaissance, then, Michelangelo develops his first masterpieces in sculpture. He does, above all, the David, a tall, nude boy looking defiantly in the distance, which is, in the end, I think, his masterpiece of sculpture. From 1508 to 1512, during that same period, 1500 to 1527, 1508 to 1512, Michelangelo does the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. For all its absurdities and weaknesses, it was a great accomplishment at very least. I'll discuss some other time its absurdities, in my opinion, not in anyone's opinion. But a great accomplishment by a young man who really wasn't primarily a painter. What a guy! What a guy! He is. He represents the best of the Italian Renaissance in some ways, Michelangelo. So versatile. I mean, a painter, a sculptor, an architect, a poet. He is the epitome of the Renaissance man. No one else can match that unless you count Leonardo for his intellectual versatility. Leonardo was a sculptor too. His sculptures were lost. His paintings were good but not great, it seems to me. So Michelangelo is the Renaissance man. What a man. I'm staying with the High Renaissance here. And during those same years, Raphael did his School of Athens, right there in Rome, right at the Vatican. Michelangelo did his Pietà in St. Peter's, that famous but kind of absurd sculpture, too. I'll discuss that sometime. Beautiful, though. What a time. But it ended suddenly in 1527 because the emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, great man, often at war in Italy, often at war his whole life, really, until he abdicated. Wonderful man. People who know about his friendship for and respect of Titian love the man. He did some stupid things, of course. He was the emperor. Emperors have to do stupid things, but he couldn't. I think he can't be blamed. Anyway, Emperor Charles V, who was, of course, from Germany mainly, led an army of mainly Protestant mercenary soldiers, Swiss especially, down, and they took and sacked Rome. Well, this was a disaster. This was a disaster. The fact that they were Protestants, I'm sure, added a lot of zeal and ferocity, ferocious, F-E-R-O-C, to their depredations. But there it was. That's the end of the Italian Renaissance right there. 1527. Easy to date. 1453, if you like, to 1527. That's the Italian Renaissance. The dates for the Renaissance overall, I remind you, 1450 to 1600. So it died in Italy, but only got started in other countries after this time. That's not quite true. It was doing pretty well a little earlier in some countries, in France. King Francis II lured Leonardo to France, where he died, lived the last 20 years of his life and died. A hero, a national hero. The French knew. Anyone who had been exposed to Italy knew. Now, I said I'd discuss Titian a little bit. Tiziano. He was from Venice, and the Venetian Renaissance was a slightly different phenomenon. Titian gave us his own birth date, 1477. 1477. He died in 1576. Wow, 99 years? Most people think, no, 1477, no. People say 1487, 1487. Even then he lived to be 89. By the way, Michelangelo lived to be 89 also. These guys, many of them lived long lives. Unfortunately, Masaccio, 27, and Raphael, 37, balanced the picture out. Very unfortunate. But Titian was from Venice. He was born in a small town outside of Venice on the mainland. The Venetian Renaissance adds a new dimension to the Renaissance because they are in love with color. And their style as colorists is determined especially by two men, Giorgione, who also died young, 32, and Bellini, who was an old master who learned to paint, relearned late in life. What a master. These guys both knew, both helped, both taught, maybe, Titian. Titian became a master by 1510. He died in 1576, as I said, and he was still painting when he died. So, 67 years? For 67 years, he was painting masterpieces. And that's true. He's the greatest of all painters, in my opinion. If the question is maybe not a very good one, but it interests people who love art, I think. And The other people who are kind of close to him, in my opinion at least, are Cézanne and Giotto. I used to have this all figured out. I don't remember exactly, but anyway. And Raphael is up there too. Okay. But Titian is the master. Now I'm going to say why he's the master. Oh, the Venetian style. Color. Colors that often blur and the outlines become unclear because everything is color. And color is light in the end. But Venice is a great place for light because there it is, that open town on the sea, surrounded by water, invaded by water, the light hitting that water, bouncing off everywhere, that blue, the sky blue, the sea blue, everything blue and bright and colorful, in good weather anyway. That's what people say to try to explain this phenomenon of the Venetian Renaissance. But color it was for most of the time. Now, Titian can be called the master of various genres, let's call them, or subgenres, art forms, and that's why I would defend his being the greatest of all. But he was not the greatest fresco artist, and he didn't care much about it. Immensely successful, the most successful of all painters in history, until Picasso, I would say, who was, of course, a millionaire. The most successful, the archetype of great artists who were great and famous in their own time, Titian. The friend to kings and emperors. I mentioned Charles the Great, Charles V before. But the French king, dukes everywhere, all of them begged for paintings. Philip II of Spain, all of them begged for paintings from Titian. Great businessman, very clever, but the forms that he mastered. First, religious art. He's the master of religious art. He's the master. A subgenre to that, the Madonna and Child, which Raphael mastered. You saw that before in the Sistine Madonna. I guess Raphael is first, Titian's second in that. But in religious art in general, Titian's the master. Second, portraiture. He's the master. Raphael second, I think. Raphael was great, and he died so early. But Titian was a master of portraiture for decades. Third, mythological painting. Now, this is obviously not religious. This is myth. This is classical antiquity. This is interest in the Greeks and Romans. Titian is all alone, the master. And fourth, what I would call current events, contemporary happenings, group paintings, family portraits, I would almost call part of that. Titian is incontestably the master. And Titian dies in 1576. At that point, the Renaissance everywhere is dead, unless you say that Titian ceased to be an Italian Renaissance painter a little earlier, and this could be argued too. So, in the end, maybe the best day to end the Renaissance is 1527. And even Titian's paintings thereafter belong to a different era, which he was the master of. Thank you.